All right, so let's start out with an introduction. Um, Here There Be Tigers is a short story written by Stephen King in 1985 as a part of the fantasy fiction slash horror genre.
We'll move directly into the character analysis. Charles is the protagonist because he's like the main character that the story evolves around, while Mrs. Bird is our antagonist because she plays up against our protagonist, where we have this kind of like villain and we have this main character which is our hero, which is the reason why we call it protagonist and antagonist instead of the main character and the side character, for instance.
Yeah, and overall, Charles seems to be a fragile child with some inner demons or just the urge to pee. But we'll be digging deeper into that in our interpretation of the short story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mrs. Bird is what we normally would characterize as a flat character because she stays the same throughout the whole story. She doesn't like evolve or have a destination to go with her character. So she just stays the same. That's the reason we call it the flat character, because she doesn't have more to her.
Yeah, and Charles is more of a round character because he evolves and has a destination with his character. He has more colored. He's a more colored character, and he's able to show emotions like fear or anger towards Mrs. Bird. Yeah. And if we are to talk about narration, the story is written with a third-person narrator, with peeks into Charles's thoughts, and the thoughts are marked with parentheses throughout the story, and this makes it possible for the reader to create insight into the deeper thoughts of Charles' mind. It also makes it easier for the reader to distinguish between conversation and thoughts, what Charles is really thinking.
Exactly. And to take like a Sigmund Freud perspective to it, the universe we're taking part in is the fantastic world, because we know this because by the end of the story we doesn't know whether or not the tiger is actually real.
And already in the beginning of the story, it's clear that King tends to use figurative language and personifications. On page 1, line 2,
yes,
isn't that right? Yeah. King already uses it with the sentence, where did I put it? Over here. His bladder was screaming. This makes the story become alive and leaves the interpretation to the reader. And King uses a lot of realistic features in order to connect and make the story more relatable to the reader. And as an example, in the short story, he uses a school and a basement as his setting, and the school represents a safe space for children, while the basement represents, the suppressed, the unknown, and the mysterious. A basement is a place where people normally, store things and stuff like that, and they don't want to show these different things. And in this instance, it represents the it, and to put a Freudian perspective on this story, the basement represents Charles' it, while the classroom represents his superego. We are able to know this by analyzing the sentence on the first page, line 2, which states, there was no longer any use in trying to fool himself. This sentence states that urinating is in his consciousness and thereby in his superego, according to the Freudian analysis.
Because it's like he has to control it himself. He didn't learn it from his ego, which was how he was raised. In the story, we're told that Charles needs to go to the bathroom to urinate. Where in the beginning of the story, Charles aren't sure whether or not he's actually going to urinate. The urination is a metaphor of his inner it. To put the Sigmund Freud analysis on it again, his inner lust and his inner urges that need to be bent from his body which is actually like a pretty smart or clever metaphor because like you're actually bending when you're peeing, like literally. We also know we all know how great it was to like finally urinate when we're in the need, and while his bladder's like almost literally screaming at him, is a metaphor of the urge and the voices in his head that commands to be let out. He then proceeds to go to the basement, which was built like an L. That's the reason we drew an L.
Drew an L.
We're described in the story that it's built like an L, and to like analyze some of the architecture of an L, there's an unknown corner right here. If you enter up here, there's an unknown corner right here.
Or if you enter here, it doesn't matter where you enter.
Exactly.
There'll be an unknown corner.
That's clever. And then the architecture of an L, there's a corner that you can't see around, which supports our theory that the reason he enters this basement is to come in contact with his inner eye, or as Sigmund Freud would put it, his id. That's like in the basement. He then enters the basement and takes a glance in the mirror to see his own reflection, where when he looks into the mirror behind him is a tiger, and the tiger could possibly represent his id, hidden in the basement. Where if you were to mention a relevant quote that occurs in the short story, it's, I don't remember which line, but it says Charles fancied he could see a tiny blue fleck in the deep brilliance, as if the tiger had eaten one of his own eyes. Where this supports the theory that the it is actually himself, where the tiger is actually himself. So he's like, it's kind of blurry whether or not it's him or the tiger. Then afterwards he briefly touches the tiger, but then goes on to close the door on the tiger. When he closes the door, it's kind of like shutting your feelings, like literally shutting a door, or shutting his inner feelings and his inner lust and his inner urges, shutting a door on them. And as it says in the text, he briefly just looks into like trying to peek in to see what's happening, which is where we get this curiosity we can see from the story of him going into the actual basement.
Yeah, the show. Yeah. So if we read between the lines, we're told that the tiger kills Kenny Griffin, Charles' classmate, and to further support our theory that the tiger represents Charles' it must have been Charles, of course, who killed Kenny Griffin, and later Mrs. Bird. Yeah,
for sure.
And if we are to make a perspective
to the horror
genre,
you could say that like a typical characteristic trick that a lot of horror movies and a lot of horror stories use is this whole suspense and surprise, where they build up this suspense and then suddenly there comes some kind of surprise as the follow-up of the suspense. This is also what's happening in the short story also read by Stephen King, The Man Who Loves Flowers, that we read earlier.
Yeah, exactly. And Stephen King's way of doing this is by making the reader comfortable and sympathize with the main character until a plot twist happens, and we are as readers left with a feeling of being emotionally divided, I think, and betrayed in some way, because nothing ends like we tried predicting from the beginning. And Stephen King also talks about the three types of horror, where this is terror, according to Stephen